You're completely useless, Margaret. Your old-fashioned ways have no place in the modern world. Those words echoed in my mind as I stared at my phone, watching her name flash on the screen at 2 a.m. The same woman who had dismissed me for 15 years was now calling, her voice broken and desperate. Margaret, I need help. I have nowhere else to turn. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons we never saw coming. My name is Margaret Rose, and at 72, I've lived through more changes than most people can imagine. I raised 4 children during times when mothers stayed home, learned to sew from my own mother who survived the Great Depression and could stretch $1 until it screamed. I preserved vegetables from my garden, made bread from scratch every Sunday, and believed that a home should be a sanctuary, built with love, patience, and practical wisdom, passed down through generations. My late husband Frank and I built our life on simple principles: waste nothing, appreciate everything, and always have enough to share with those in need. We weathered financial storms, raised our children through good times and lean ones, and created a home where neighbors knew they could come for a cup of coffee, a listening ear, or help with whatever crisis life threw their way. When my youngest, son David, married Jessica 8 years ago, I thought I was gaining a daughter. I had such hopes. I imagined teaching her our family recipes, sharing stories about David's childhood, maybe even having her help me tend to my vegetable garden. I pictured holiday mornings where she'd curl up next to me on the couch, drinking coffee and watching the children play with toys I'd carefully made by hand. Jessica was everything I wasn't. A successful marketing executive with designer clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a corner office on the 20th floor of a downtown high-rise, and strong opinions about everything from politics to parenting, philosophies she'd never had to test. She lived in a pristine, modern townhouse where everything was white, minimalist, and expensive. Even her kitchen looked like it belonged in a magazine, all granite and stainless steel, without a single sign that actual cooking happened there. From our very first meeting at David's birthday dinner, Jessica made it crystal clear that my way of life was not just different, but inferior. When I offered to teach her my grandmother's apple pie recipe, the same one that had been treasured in our family for 4 generations, she actually laughed out loud. "Margaret, I don't have time. For that domestic stuff, I can buy better pies at Whole Foods. Besides, all that sugar and butter, it's basically poison." When I gently suggested she might want to learn some basic sewing to hem David's pants, something I'd done for Frank for 43 years of marriage, she rolled her eyes so dramatically, I thought they might get stuck. That's what tailors are for. Why would I waste time on something so useless? My time is worth $200 an hour. It makes more financial sense to pay someone else. That word, useless, became her favorite adjective when describing anything I did or valued. My homemade Christmas gifts were useless crafts that just create clutter. My advice about budgeting was useless old-school thinking that doesn't apply to modern finances. My offers to babysit their future children were met with detailed plans for professional childcare, not useless grandma time that might fill their heads with outdated ideas. The criticism extended to everything that defined my world. My garden was unnecessary labor when you can buy organic vegetables. My habit of preserving seasonal fruits was unsanitary compared to store-bought canned goods. My church activities were a waste of time that could be spent networking. Even my choice to clip coupons was embarrassing penny pinching that signals poverty mindset. David tried desperately to bridge the gap between his 2 worlds. I watched my son, my baby boy, who used to help me bake cookies every Sunday, struggle to defend me without offending his wife. He'd make weak attempts. "Mom's actually really good at managing money, Jess." Or, "You should see how much she saves with those coupons." But Jessica would shut him down with a look that said she wouldn't tolerate any disagreement. At family dinners, the tension was suffocating. Jessica would check her phone constantly while I spoke, interrupt my stories with "fascinating" in a tone that suggested the complete opposite, and redirect every conversation to her latest business triumph or the expensive vacation they were planning. When I'd try to share memories of David's childhood, like the time he spent weeks building a birdhouse for Father's Day, she'd sigh audibly and make comments about living in the past instead of building the future. The worst part was watching how it affected my relationship with David. The son who used to call me 3 times a week started calling once a month. The boy who used to drop by just to check on me began making formal appointments to visit. I could see in his eyes that he was caught between love for his mother and fear of his wife's disapproval. Her disdain wasn't limited to my lifestyle choices. She questioned my intelligence, my relevance, even my right to have opinions about modern issues. When I mentioned struggling to understand new technology, she'd make comments about digital dinosaurs holding back progress. When I shared concerns about rising costs of groceries, she'd lecture me about failing to adapt to economic realities. But perhaps the cruelest cut was how she treated my attempts to connect with her personally. I'd ask about her work, her interests, her dreams for the future. She'd answer with the bare minimum courtesy before turning the conversation back to herself. It was clear she saw me not as a person with my own experiences and wisdom, but as an outdated relic she had to tolerate for David's sake. The breaking point came last Thanksgiving, though looking back it had been building for months. I had spent 3 days preparing David's favorite dishes, the same meal I'd lovingly crafted for 30 years of family gatherings. The turkey was brined with herbs from my garden, the stuffing made from bread I'd baked myself, the cranberry sauce created from berries I'd preserved last fall. Every dish held memories, traditions, and hours of careful preparation. Jessica arrived an hour late, bursting through the door with her phone pressed to her ear, finishing what sounded like a work call even though it was a holiday. She barely acknowledged the rest of the family. My 3 other children and their families had all gathered, as was our tradition. Instead, she surveyed the dinner table with the kind of expression you might wear when encountering a historical reenactment. "This looks like something from a 1950s cookbook," she announced to the entire table, her voice carrying that familiar tone of amused superiority. "Margaret, don't you think it's time to evolve? All this domestic theater is just so useless. In today's world, we're not living in pioneer times anymore." The conversation at the table stopped. My daughter Sarah looked uncomfortable. My son Michael cleared his throat awkwardly, and David stared at his empty plate as if it might provide an escape route. But Jessica wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and started showing everyone photos she'd apparently prepared for this moment. "Look at this elevated Thanksgiving experience I found. It's at this amazing restaurant downtown. They deconstruct all the traditional elements into modern interpretations. Dehydrated turkey foam, cranberry caviar spheres, molecular mashed potatoes. This is what Thanksgiving could look like if we embraced innovation instead of clinging to useless traditions." She swiped through image after image, her voice growing more animated. "They even have a sommelier who pairs each course with artisanal wines. Can you imagine? Instead of spending 3 days slaving over a hot stove, we could have a sophisticated dining experience that actually reflects our education and social status." My granddaughter Emma, only 8 years old, piped up with innocent confusion. "But Grandma Margaret's turkey tastes really good, and I like helping her make the stuffing." Jessica's laugh was sharp. "Oh, sweetie, when you're older you'll understand that just because something tastes familiar doesn't mean it's the best option. Grandma Margaret's cooking is very quaint, but we can do so much better now. No offense, Margaret, but your generation's idea of contribution is just outdated. We need to embrace modern solutions, not cling to useless traditions that keep us stuck in the past." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt every eye at the table, felt the weight of my family's discomfort, felt the sting of being reduced to nothing more than an embarrassing relic in front of the people I loved most. But what happened next was somehow worse than Jessica's words. Nobody defended me. My own children, adults I'd raised, sacrificed for, supported through their own struggles, sat in uncomfortable silence. David finally mumbled something about how both approaches have merit, which was somehow more hurtful than if he'd said nothing at all. I excused myself to the kitchen, where I stood gripping the edge of the sink, staring out at my winter garden and fighting back tears. Through the dining room doorway, I could hear Jessica continuing her monologue about progressive holiday celebrations and breaking free from limiting generational patterns. That night, after everyone had gone home and I was alone with dishes, that suddenly felt like evidence of my own foolishness, I made a decision that would define the next chapter of our relationship. If my presence was so useless, if my contributions were so antiquated, if my love expressed through cooking and caring was nothing more than an embarrassing display of outdated thinking, then I would remove myself from the equation. I stopped, calling David and Jessica. When they called me, which wasn't often, I kept conversations brief and polite. I declined invitations to their dinner parties and social gatherings. When David asked why I seemed distant, I simply said I wanted to give them space to enjoy their modern lifestyle without the burden of my old-fashioned ways. The months that followed were the loneliest of my life. I threw myself into my garden, my church activities, and my volunteer work at the local food bank. Places where my skills were still valued, where my contributions still mattered. But the absence of my youngest son and his family left a hole in my daily routine that nothing could fill. I watched from a distance as Jessica's career continued to flourish. Her social media was full of photos from expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, and work events where she mingled with other successful professionals. She seemed to be living proof that her way was the right way, that rejecting traditional domestic skills in favor of financial success and sophisticated experiences was the path to happiness. But life, as I've learned over 7 decades, has a way of humbling even the most confident among us. It started small. Rumors in the industry that Jessica's company was struggling. Then came news of layoffs, though Jessica initially seemed confident she was safe. Her social media posts became more defensive, filled with motivational quotes about pivoting and embracing new opportunities. When the axe finally fell, it fell hard. Jessica wasn't just laid off. She was part of a massive restructuring that eliminated her entire department. Her severance package, while seeming generous at first, wouldn't last long, given their expensive lifestyle. And her industry contacts, the professional network she'd cultivated so carefully, suddenly seemed less reliable when everyone was competing for the same limited opportunities. Then David got sick. It started as what seemed like a simple flu, but weeks passed without improvement. The doctors ran test after test before finally diagnosing him with a severe case of mononucleosis, complicated by chronic fatigue syndrome. He would be essentially bedridden for months, unable to work, unable to contribute to their household income, at the exact moment when Jessica needed his support most. Suddenly, The woman who had built her identity on being independent and financially successful found herself unemployed, watching their savings dwindle, and caring for a sick husband while facing the very real possibility of losing everything they'd worked to build. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I almost didn't answer. At my age, calls at that hour rarely bring good news, but something made me reach for the phone. "Margaret?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from crying and so different from the confident executive tone I'd grown accustomed to hearing. "I am now, Jessica. What's wrong?" The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. I could hear her breathing, uneven and shaky, and what sounded like muffled sobs. When she finally spoke, her words came in a rush, like a dam bursting. I don't know who else to call. I've called everyone I can think of. My parents are on that cruise in Europe and won't be back for 3 weeks. My sister in California says she can't help with money right now because of her own mortgage problems. My work friends. God, Margaret, I thought they were real friends, but the moment I lost my job, they all suddenly became too busy to return my calls. She paused, and I could hear her struggling to control her breathing. David's still sick. He can't even get out of bed most days. And the doctor says it could be months before he's back to normal. I've been trying to handle everything alone, but I'm failing at all of it. Where are you now, Jessica? At home, sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m. because I can't sleep. I haven't eaten a real meal in 3 days because I don't know how to cook. Anything that doesn't come in a package or get delivered. And we can't afford takeout anymore. Do you know how pathetic that is? I'm 32 years old, and I don't know how to feed myself. Her voice broke completely then. The electricity might get shut off next week. I've never missed a payment on anything in my entire adult life, and now I'm looking at shut-off notices and past-due warnings, and I don't know what to do. I applied for unemployment, but it's a fraction of what I was making, and our mortgage payment alone is more than most people make in a month. I sat up in bed, my heart doing something complicated between aching and racing. This was the woman who had dismissed me as useless, who had mocked my way of life as outdated and irrelevant. But hearing her pain, her genuine terror at facing, problems she'd never imagined having, I couldn't summon any satisfaction from her downfall. "Margaret," she continued, her voice getting smaller with each word. I know I haven't been kind to you. I know I've said things that were hurtful and dismissive. But I'm scared, really scared. I don't know how people survive when everything falls apart. I don't have the skills you have. I can negotiate million-dollar marketing campaigns. But I can't figure out how to make a grocery budget last more than 3 days. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I called you because even though I've been terrible to you, you're the strongest person I know. You raised 4 children. You've been through hard times. You know how to make things work when life gets difficult. I was wrong to call your skills useless. They're exactly what I need now, and I don't have them." The woman who had called me useless was asking for my help. And despite everything, despite years of casual cruelty and dismissiveness, I found myself thinking not about revenge, but about my David lying sick and helpless, and about Jessica, arrogant, hurtful Jessica, sitting alone in her pristine house, finally understanding that all her success hadn't prepared her for real hardship. I could have hung up. I could have reminded her of every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every time she'd made me feel small and irrelevant. I could have told her that karma was finally catching up, that she was reaping what she'd sown, that maybe now she'd understand the value of the useless skills she'd mocked. Instead, I heard my mother's voice in my head, my mother who had survived the depression, who had taught me that kindness isn't about what people deserve. It's about who you choose to be when someone needs you most. I'll be there in the morning, I said simply. The sob of relief that came through the phone was so raw, so grateful, that I felt my own eyes fill with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Margaret. I don't deserve your help, but thank you." After I hung up, I sat in my bedroom for a long time, staring out at the streetlights and thinking about the strange turns life takes. Jessica had spent years treating me like I was invisible, like my knowledge and experience were worthless relics of a bygone era. Now she was discovering what I'd always known, that fancy degrees and high salaries can't teach you how to survive. When life strips away everything you thought made you secure. I spent the rest of the night gathering supplies, my old recipe box, a bag of basic groceries, some of my preserves and homemade bread, and a small notebook where I'd write down the practical wisdom she'd need to learn, not because she deserved it, but because David needed a stable home to recover in, and because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to become the villain in someone else's story, even when they've given you every reason to be one. I arrived at Jessica's pristine townhouse at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying a single worn duffel bag and 2 boxes, one filled with groceries that had cost me $37, the other containing mason jars of preserves, homemade bread, and basic cooking supplies that Jessica had once dismissed as primitive. She opened the door looking like a completely different person from the polished executive I'd known for 8 years. Her usually immaculate brown hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore wrinkled pajamas that looked like she'd slept in them for days, and her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen from crying. The confident posture was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, stepping aside to let me in. I know you didn't have to. Walking into her house felt surreal. The space that had once intimidated me with its magazine-perfect aesthetics now told a different story. The white furniture showed every stain and smudge. The minimalist design offered no comfort or warmth, and there were signs of struggle everywhere. Unpaid bills stacked on the granite counters, empty takeout containers overflowing from the trash, dishes piling up in the sink, because she'd been rationing her energy for more pressing problems. The kitchen that had once seemed like a showcase felt cold and sterile, all stainless steel and granite, with no signs that anyone actually knew how to use it for its intended purpose. The refrigerator, when I opened it, contained little more than condiments, some expired milk, and a few energy bars that probably cost more per ounce than ground beef. "When did you last eat a real meal?" I asked, setting down my boxes and surveying the space. "I had some crackers yesterday. Maybe the day before. I don't really remember." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. "Margaret, I have to tell you something, and it's going to sound incredibly stupid. I don't know how to do any of this. I've never had to budget or cook real food or survive without money. I've spent my entire adult life outsourcing everything. Meal delivery, cleaning services, dry cleaning, even grocery shopping through apps. I feel so completely helpless." I started unpacking groceries, simple ingredients that had cost a fraction of what she used to spend on a single lunch. Rice, dried beans, root vegetables, onions, a whole chicken, flour, eggs, basic spices. Items that could be transformed into dozens of meals with the right knowledge. "You're not helpless, Jessica," I said, pulling out a well-worn apron from my bag. "You just learned different skills than I did, but skills can be taught." Over the next several hours, I began Jessica's education in what she had once called Useless domestic theater. I showed her how to break down that whole chicken into 8 pieces, using every part. The breast meat for one meal, thighs and legs for another, bones for stock that would become the base for soup. I taught her to make a filling, nutritious meal with rice, beans, and vegetables that cost less than one of her former artisanal coffee drinks. She watched with the desperate attention of someone who finally understood the stakes, asking questions she never would have thought to ask before. How do you know when the onions are ready? What's the difference between sautéing and frying? How long will this keep in the refrigerator? When I showed her how to make bread, the same recipe she'd once dismissed as unnecessary labor, her hands shook as she kneaded the dough. "This feels impossible," she admitted. "I can't believe you do this from memory." "I've been making this bread for 50 years, I told her gently. "My mother taught it to me when I was younger than you are now. One batch will feed you and David for 3 days, and it costs less than a single fancy coffee. I used to spend $15 a day on coffee," she admitted quietly, working the dough awkwardly but with growing confidence. 20 on some days if I got one of those specialty drinks. I thought that was just normal. I thought everyone lived like that. "Many people do," I said, guiding her hands to show her the proper kneading technique. "But most people can't afford to, and when times get hard, those habits become impossible to maintain." As the bread rose, I taught her about budgeting, not the theoretical kind they might have covered in business school, but the practical, daily reality of making every dollar count. We went through her bills together, and I showed her how to prioritize. Shelter, utilities, food, everything else comes after. I helped her understand the difference between wants and needs, a distinction that had become blurred during years of financial abundance. "I never realized how much we were spending on things that didn't actually matter," she said, looking at her credit card statements with new eyes. $300 a month on subscription services I barely used, $200 on supplements that probably did nothing, $400 on clothes I wore once. By mid-afternoon, David had awakened from his nap, still weak, but clearly feeling better than he had in weeks. He shuffled into the kitchen and stopped short, staring at the scene before him. His wife, hair covered by one of my spare aprons, hands covered in flour, carefully shaping her second attempt at bread, while I guided her through the process. "Mom?" he said, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable. "What are you doing here?" "Teaching Jessica some things she needs to know," I said simply. But the real transformation became evident that evening. Jessica had successfully prepared her first complete home-cooked meal using my guidance: roasted chicken with vegetables, fresh bread, and a simple salad. As we sat at her dining table, the same one where she'd once dismissed my traditions as useless theater, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Margaret, I owe you more than an apology," she said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I owe you about 1,000 apologies. For 8 years, I called your skills useless because I was afraid of being seen as domestic, as traditional, as less than the modern woman I thought I was supposed to be. I thought if I rejected everything that looked like my grandmother's life, I'd be more valuable, more relevant, more successful." She paused, struggling to find words for something she'd clearly been thinking about all day. "But watching you today, seeing how you can create abundance from almost nothing, how you can solve problems I couldn't even identify, I realize I've been incredibly wrong. You're not stuck in the past. You have knowledge that transcends time. You can thrive in any situation because you understand the fundamentals of living, not just the surface decorations of success. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Jessica, we all have different strengths. You built an impressive career, navigated complex business relationships, achieved things I never could have. This crisis doesn't erase those accomplishments, but it proves that what you know, what I called useless, these are the skills that actually matter when life gets unpredictable, she said, her laugh hollow but not bitter. I can develop marketing strategies for Fortune 500 companies, but I couldn't figure out how to feed my family on $50 a week. What kind of capable adult does that make me? It makes you human, I said. None of us knows everything. The difference is whether we're willing to learn when life teaches us what we're missing. What's your story of unexpected resilience or finding value in what others dismiss? Share it below. I'd love to hear how life taught you lessons you never saw coming.